Okay then. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll kick off what is now the third online seminar series from Durham following the lockdown from Durham Energy Institute. And I must say, they've been working particularly well. Just a few notices. Lynn, if she hasn't already, will be circulating a list of speakers for the next couple of months to all of those who registered and more besides, so you can pick and choose what you want to listen to. So without further ado, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Dr. Andrew Crossland. I've known Andrew, well, not quite since he was in short pants, but certainly since he was a very enthusiastic, fully engaged postgraduate student here in Durham University in the engineering department, and a stalwart really of the student body interacting with the Energy Institute at that time. And we haven't got rid of him yet. We've published together. Andrew has been a great supporter of activity in terms of outreach, and I think it was last April he joined us on a Saturday morning to travel all the way up to Berwick to give a one-day seminar to the science group based in Berwick. And so he really is a very close friend and great supporter of DEI. And some of you will be aware of his MyGrid website, which allows you to track how well or otherwise we're doing in the UK when it comes to decarbonisation of power. So today, Andrew will be speaking on decarbonisation of electricity and a view from the Pacific. And I'll just pick up on what have I missed out here. So Andrew did his PhD, as I mentioned here, working on solar energy storage for networks and microgrids in East Africa. And as I mentioned already, he runs the MyGrid energy tracking platform and is a consultant of Advanced Further Energy, which focuses on enabling low carbon transitions in domestic energy policy and microgrid sectors. He previously worked as an energy specialist at Solar Century, focusing on battery storage and solar projects in both the UK and East Africa. And then he took on a role at a world-leading organisation, Infotech, based in New Zealand. And he works on all manner of low-carbon projects, including putting power lines on an active volcano. Well, perhaps rather him than me. So, Andrew, I'm delighted to give you the floor. Please fire away.
Thanks for that introduction, John. I hope you can all hear me okay. Please do flag up in the chat window if you've got any sound issues. And as John says, please fire questions in. I'm looking at those as you send them in. I'll try and answer them, some of them as we go, and obviously some of them at the end. And I've provided my contact details if people want to connect after the talk. Yeah, as John says, the focus of today's seminar really is on the work we're doing in the Pacific at the moment. And we'll go through what I'm defining as the Pacific for the sake of today's talk, and with a real view on decarbonisation of electricity, which is a very very hot topic around the world. And I know some of you are also keen to see what that means for heat and for vehicles, but I'll touch on that as well. We're going to try and keep the talk to 30 minutes. We'll see how we get on, and hopefully get a really interactive set of questions at the end. But the key message of today really is, and part of the reason why I went to New Zealand is what I think we're seeing in the Pacific at the moment in terms of decarbonisation journeys. It's really teaching us how we might manage grids in Europe in the future. So we're going from systems which are very, very heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and rapidly, sometimes in the sort of timescales of 2 or 3 years, transitioning those to systems which run on almost completely on solar or wind energy with some battery storage. So it's a great place to work, and I'll talk a bit about Infotech, my employer's role in that in a few slides' time. The main sort of overview of today's seminar. I mean, firstly, I think it's important to give you some context around the Pacific Island nations that we work in and their energy systems. How is their energy supplied? What challenges are they facing now? And what's driving change in those areas? And I think that's a really important thing, because there's a lot of obvious things you would see happening in the Pacific. But there's also some not so obvious things which you only really learn by working there. I'll then talk about renewable energy development, just generally what's driving that, critically how it's funded, which has real impacts on the engineering and the social aspect, and some of the challenges we're facing on projects. So John mentioned building on an active volcano. I'm going to talk to you about what that means. And that will sort of close out the webinar. I think the projects at the end, I think you'll find very interesting, Tonga and Tuvalu, and it's worth Wikipediaing or Google Earthing, particularly Tuvalu, the main island there, for later on in the talk. Just a bit of a summary about my employer, Infratec. I met there. They were a very, very small company when I met them, 3 or 4 people, and I met their head of engineering, which is a very nominal title in a company of 4 people at the time, at a training course in Germany. We worked together commissioning projects. He was in Afghanistan and I was in Kenya. And yeah, he offered me a job one day, said, would you come out? I said, yeah. And they've come out of a lines company, a very, very traditional utility company in southern New Zealand. Not a particularly, there's nothing special about the company they come from. They're very, very vanilla. They run poles and wires to a largish area, probably the size of Northern England. But they really recognise the emergence of new technology, particularly battery storage, and what that could mean for them, and set up Infotech really as a company that has to wash its face financially, but also potentially bringing some of that technology back into their networks. As of 2020, we've now got over 20 employees. We've grown very, very quickly, and we work across the Pacific, Indonesia, New Zealand, and we even did some consulting in the Northeast last year. Some of the projects we do a lot of building work, so construction of solar and battery projects. In Indonesia, we're doing an amazing project working with the utility in one of the regions there. Somewhere called, it's called close to the Banda Arc. If anyone knows about Indonesian history, that's pretty significant. It's part of the reason why we have New York and not New Amsterdam. But over there, we're working with the utility, capacity building, working in the world's biggest archipelago, trying to work out how they decarbonise. And also New Zealand, obviously, very interesting market for us, which is all about bringing clean energy, particularly solar, to those networks. And our value proposition really is what we call thought leadership. And that's taking on projects that most organisations wouldn't touch. We're very, very flexible and light in our approach. We're very good at really tackling difficult problems, such as putting power on a volcano, and being prepared to do that and try and make money for doing so. As hopefully we'll see today, I think that means we're doing some world-leading work all over the world, which is part of a wider decarbonisation journey around the world, which is great. John gave you a bit of background. I'll touch on it briefly. So obviously did my PhD in Durham, very active in the DEI and the Centre for Doctoral Training, which I think remains a fantastic place for students to learn, particularly the interdisciplinary nature of it. And I don't say that because the DEI hosting this seminar. That's genuine, and that's how I feel. And I think you'll see in the presentation today how that's driven a lot of thinking in myself and organisations I work with. That being said, I left university thinking, you know, you can get a bit blinkered in a PhD, and tried to leave the energy sector. I tried that for, it wasn't actually a year, it was 9 months at Network Rail. And in that time I founded, basically after a few months I realised energy was my calling, founded MyGrid GB, which lets you track electricity usage in the UK. I'll touch upon that later. And ended up working in London for one of the largest solar companies in the UK, working on energy storage there and working with some amazing people. It really is a fantastic organisation, Solar Century. 2018, I was offered the role in New Zealand, which is what the focus of today's talk is. And I also founded a consultancy in the UK, which looks particularly at the domestic market and consumer protection. So we're working very closely with the standards body for domestic solar and storage in the UK and putting in standards to ensure consumers are protected and technical compliance. But I think what you wanted to ask me about today and what you wanted to hear about was the work going on in the Pacific, and I'll just define what I mean by that. The Pacific is loosely defined as New Zealand as the main, the sort of largest population and land mass, with a number of small island nations around that. Excluding Papua New Guinea, we're talking a population of 3.3 million, which is less than the population of Croatia. We're not talking a large land area, about 80% of the size of the UK, and that's spread out over an entire ocean. Lots and lots of smaller nations. Tuvalu's got a population about equivalent to the town I was born in, which none of you have ever heard of. We've worked in the Cook Islands, which have tiny populations spread over a number of small islands. Fiji is obviously a big tourist mecca. It's probably one of the bigger islands, but it's small compared to anything we might be used to. And the Pacific history is, I think very interesting. If you go to museums in New Zealand and look at, particularly call it the Pacific migration and how people arrived here, what we think people came over from New Guinea, which is north of Australia, migrating first to Samoa, out to near Tahiti. And it was only very, very recently, less than 800 years ago, that humans actually arrived on New Zealand, where I'm based, migrating down from Tahiti and Tonga. That migration is pretty inspiring. It's really interesting to read about that journey. And it's also very interesting environmentally living in New Zealand. It was a continent that didn't know mammals until humans arrived, and we brought dogs and rats and stoats and ferrets and deer, and it wreaked havoc with the local wildlife, particularly the bird population. And that's led to an incredibly strong environmental movement that's absolutely core to how New Zealanders behave and believe. It's very, very interesting to read about. But more generally, outside of New Zealand, in these island nations, I think it's important just to appreciate what issues are going on there, and we'll see eventually how that relates to energy. So we're thinking about these tiny countries scattered all over the Pacific, and they're actually of incredible international importance. The UK and France still have presences there. The US and New Zealand and Australia all have dependencies or parts of their nations in those areas, and control of these countries or influence is thought to help you influence your ability to defend yourself and the ability to trade across the Pacific. So huge interest from China, lots of aid projects going in with Chinese, US, Australian, New Zealand money to build infrastructure to keep these countries aligned in various ways. There's a lot of low GDP per capita in these countries. The country of Nauru is incredibly interesting and quite famous at the moment for the place where an Australian migrant camp is located, but historically one of the richest countries in the world. It's a small island, and it just used to export phosphate for fertilizer until they ran out of phosphate, and now it's one of the poorest countries in the world. Due to the small populations, they generally have fairly weak political institutions relative to what we're used to, but very, very, I'd still say they're capable, they're just weaker than what we might be used to. Limited natural resources, but and limited skilled labour. People tend to move abroad. It's a brain drain, particularly to Australia and New Zealand. Resiliency to weather-related natural disasters, particularly sea level rise, is very prevalent and very important. So we we'll see later on that one country we work in is no higher than 6 meters off the ground at any point. So they're very, very immediately impacted by climate change, and as such they're seeking to take leadership on climate change and decarbonisation. But it's not just climate change in terms of environment. There's a lot of environmental damage, acidification of coral, which is ironically reducing the tourist industry, which is potentially reducing flying, as well as COVID. But as well, having been on these places, some of the plastic pollution is incredible. One of the islands we've worked on, the western side of the island, was these beautiful crisp sand beaches, turquoise blue ocean, but on the eastern side you could walk on the plastic, which had fallen out of a container ship and washed up all these plastic toys that had just washed up on the island. And with a population of 60 people on there, there's nowhere to put that plastic. It just stays there and ruins the environment. I've flown between the two Samoan islands and seen the plastic floating on the ocean. I think this it does get quite irritating reading online about claims that these plastic seas and plastic islands are lies when you've physically seen them yourself. The environment is very acutely affected in these places. And as we'll see, there's a lot of fishing going on. That's not necessarily sustainable, the volumes that are being caught in all places, and large amounts of foreign aid going in as a result of the strategic importance of the islands. I think it's also important to just understand the economy of these places as well. I put up an image there of the economy of Fiji, how that's broken down according to Wikipedia. But we're thinking places that will rarely have a diverse economy. So Fiji might be the exception with tourism and fishing and produce going on, but Tuvalu makes a huge amount of its money on the fact its domain name on the internet is .tv, and any media organisation with .tv on their web address is paying money to Tuvalu for their domain name. And Pitcairn, where the I think it was a mutiny on the Bounty ended up, they sell stamps to stamp collectors, and that makes a major part of the economy. So these aren't rich places. It's hard for them to diversify income, and that presents some real challenges for energy, as we'll see. And I think it's important to understand that link between economy and energy. If we go into an island and we want to, or the island utility is wanting to build a larger energy system, then it will only be as big as the economic activity that can purchase that energy. So you don't build an enormous power station the size of Hinkley Point on Tonga, because there's not enough consumers to take that power. But on the flip side, you need energy in order to create economic output. So we need to build a cheap, low carbon, low cost, highly reliable power system in order to stimulate the economic activity that's needed. And a really good example of that is the island of Kiangle in northern Palau, where we've been working. The project was specified to meet the present electricity demand, which is some HVAC for air conditioning, maybe some TVs and lights. But as soon as we put cheap, reliable power in, people wanted a giant freezer to freeze the fish to create, so they could then export fish and create income. And that changes, in fact, potentially overloads the energy system that had been specified. So we have this real sensitivity in our projects and also in the energy sector more generally between what's there at present to justify an energy system and an energy supply versus putting that in and what that might create and what that demands. And that's a constant thread we see in the Pacific. I'll just give you an overview more specifically on how energy, specifically electricity, is provided in these places. In summary, there's an incredibly heavy reliance on fossil fuels to make electricity, and I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone. We're talking about very, very large, a variety of diesel generators normally, using normally conventional diesel. They're very mechanical, they're not very smart, they don't have any technology often. Oh, go on. I think someone's going to ask a question there. Oh, maybe not. Yeah, so there's a heavy reliance on so with these engines, they're not enabled with technologies to limit fuel consumption. So for example, battery systems which can load the generators in the right way to maximize fuel efficiency. There's very few examples of biofuels. I've never come across that directly as a low carbon alternative. And a lot of heavy engineering going on, but it's important to say that's with very limited access to spare parts. So Tuvalu, for example, would be 2 days of flying from New Zealand to get there. I think there's two flights go in every week. So if there's a major issue or a major failure, how do you get those parts in and service it? And unfortunately, very, very limited renewable energy. So very, very high reliance on fossil fuel. And that's got a number of consequences. There's a very, very good report by the Pacific Power Association, which I'd recommend everyone read. It's called the Benchmarking Report. And the heavy reliance on diesel means that fuel and energy is expensive. In the UK, we pay around 20 US cents per kilowatt hour in our homes. That pays for the generation electricity, the networks, the retailers, running the system, and obviously profit, simplistically. In the Pacific, most countries, just to generate power is more expensive than we pay in our homes in the UK, and these are not wealthy countries. The reasons for that, primarily diesel in itself is an expensive way of generating power. You have to, in addition with these islands, it's very, very costly. The logistics of getting diesel to the islands is very costly. They have to pay to store that energy. And because of the size and configuration of a lot of the grids, the generators are just not very efficient at generating power. And that means power is expensive. And you would think that would drive us into a position where renewables would make sense. The problem is, across the Pacific, I think there's only one utility which generates more low carbon energy than the UK does. They've got some of the best sunshine hours in the world. We've got fairly good wind speeds. I'm sure people will want to know about tidal or hydro energy or biofuels, etc. Any analysis you would do would say that renewables, and have been for a long time, cheaper than diesel, rely on local energy, not imports, so you don't have to find US dollars to buy your fuel. The economic drivers for renewable energy are there, but it just hasn't happened yet. And that's a real focus and a real challenge when we think that these islands really, really want to show leadership in decarbonisation, are acutely affected by climate change, but equally, are running on diesel. The other thing to say is, these aren't big electricity systems either. If we go through all of the electricity systems and add them all up across the Pacific, well, the power station that got me into energy in the first place, which is West Burton, just outside of Retford, you could run the entire Pacific Ocean just from that one power station. If you could get power there, we're not talking about a large number of megawatts, and that's partly a result of low energy use. That's partly a result of high prices. That's just partly a result of these being small countries with low population and lower industrial activity. So although decarbonisation is really important, it's a drop in the ocean compared to some of the energy use that's going on in the UK. So what does this actually translate to? What does all this sort of political background mean in the wider Pacific context? Well, the Pacific Island states are very active in the climate change negotiations, and as such, they've set very, very aggressive targets to achieve very, very high or 100% renewable energy targets. So Samoa, the Cook Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, have all set targets to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030. Some of them are aspiring to get very, very close to that by 2020. And they're really, really keen to show leadership in this area for political and economic reasons. The exceptions to that are, well, one of them is Guam, which is an American island which seems less concerned about decarbonisation at the moment, but particularly the islands with heavy tourist economies, or those economies focused on New Zealand, Australian, Western interests are heavily targeting renewables, and that presents a very, very interesting market. Just to reinforce the economics to you, this came from Chris, he's a really, really good business development manager for the Pacific, and he looked at all the costs of electricity, the amount of people are paying for power across the Pacific and the countries we work in, and in the Solomon Islands they're paying $1.20 a kilowatt hour, which is 6 times more than we pay in the UK for electricity. And he found that in pretty much every country, the cost of energy from solar and battery was lower or a comparable cost to what's being paid now. Just to reinforce really how close we are, how good the economics for a transition to renewable energy is how much these technologies can reduce and stabilize energy bills. And that's attracted a huge amount of donor funding to the Pacific. World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the development parts of government in New Zealand and Australia and Japan and Europe and the US are pumping money into projects, donor-funded projects in the region. Cook Islands, $33 million. Samoa, over $200 million in energy programs. Micronesia, $100 million. We're talking huge, huge sums of money being put in by donors to try and build low carbon technology in these areas. And we'll see as well as later on, as well as donors, we've got institutional investors now looking at this region, putting in solar assets and trying to make money off that as the traditional investment. So before we get into that, let's just really dive down into the changing electricity systems on some of these islands. Just to simplify that journey, right now we're talking pretty much 100% or 90% of electricity from diesel power. And the journey for these islands is some early solar and wind projects that may provide 10%, 15% of their electricity. Very, very simple, solar on roofs, small solar farms, that kind of thing. We're seeing some of the smaller islands really electrifying, putting networks in, putting solar and batteries in. Where Infotech are working now is sort of for the first large battery projects on some of these places, which will essentially allow the diesel engines to be switched off during the day when the sun's shining. And the ultimate ambition is to get to 90% or 100% renewable energy with large batteries and large distributed solar arrays all around these islands. It's important to reinforce, and I don't want to go into the technical detail too much because that's an 8-hour seminar, is the increasing complexity that means. So running a diesel engine, you and I could do that in our garage, running a large and complex electricity system with tens of solar arrays, large batteries, diesel engines switching in and out, maybe some wind, maybe some hydro, is complex. And that's an important challenge that we need to understand. And I'd like to actually just summarize those challenges because I think it's important to step back and have some perspective on the challenges that decarbonisation means. I've divided this into three what I call lenses, a technical lens, a financial lens, and a social lens. And this is a real nod to the interdisciplinary thinking of the DEI, but also just the realities of how we look at these projects at Infotech. So some of the challenges we might see in the technical lens, we've got very, very unsophisticated control systems in power stations that are just designed to run diesel engines, nothing more than that. We've got power networks that aren't designed to cope with large amounts of solar and large amounts of renewables in them. And also we've got a land access. These are small islands with small land area. Where do we physically fit the solar and the wind and the hydro in those places? So key technical challenges we might face. Within the financial lens, renewable energy takes a large amount of capital up front. You're in essence buying 25 years of power up front, and a lot of these places don't have the capital to pay for that. So if you're just selling fish or stamps, how do you find the tens of millions of dollars to buy a big solar farm? There's an investment not just in capital but in people. How do you pay to train people on this new technology? You've got to fly them abroad to learn about it. You don't want them learning when the solar appears. As well as that, building any kind of large infrastructure project requires oversight from banks and regulatory institutions that may not necessarily be there in country. And that's very, very important for the economics to ensure people are getting value for money. Within the social lens, it's really, really important to understand, the human factors involved. If we go to a country that's got a population of 80,000 people, it's hard to find very, very high-skilled. I mean, it's hard enough in the UK to find high-skilled people. So finding high-skilled people to run these power systems is difficult. And if you do, they often want to go elsewhere. And paying for power, we'll see later on. It's all very well putting in energy systems and expanding access, but people have to be able to pay for it to make it viable and justify the loans and the investments that people are making. And spare parts. If something goes wrong for me on the car I'm building or the diesel engine or whatever, you can nip down to Screwfix or B&Q or wherever, and you get the spare part. Some of these places they take 2-3 days to get to. And that makes things very challenging. In terms of financing, I think it's nice to just touch on how these projects are financed. And we're going to spend $10 million on a solar and battery project. Well, the classic would be an outright purchase by the island or the government paid for up front, maybe using debt funding, and that takes a large internal project oversight, and it often just doesn't happen. There isn't the capability or the money or the appetite to do that. So we've seen, particularly over the past 3 years, a large amount of donor-funded projects, particularly from the Asian Development Bank and World Bank, and that comes with a lot of the assistance that's needed to specify the projects, run the projects, provide the technical oversight, the owners, engineers, etc., that are needed to deliver these projects. But of course, that's only as good as a government or a utility that's prepared to take on that work. And there's an increasing number of what we call independent power producers appearing. These are investors, mostly from Europe at the moment, who are prepared to invest, to build their own solar and battery projects at their own cost, using their own money, and engage in long-term contracts with these islands and the governments or the utilities to buy the power up front. And that's an expanding market, particularly at the, not just at government scale, but also hotels. And Chris is very lucky, who's our BD. He gets to go to these 5-star resorts in Fiji and sell them solar and batteries that are funded externally, and the hotels buy power from him. That's why he says he goes out there anyway. Just to finish off the talk, I guess it'd be great to talk about, or just tell you some of the projects that we're actually working on at Infotech. And the first one I'd like to introduce you to is what's called the Tonga Renewable Energy Project 3, or TREP 3, which is a project to electrify 5 islands in northern Tonga. These islands don't have any power at the moment, apart from one's got a solar water pumping system. And they're funded by the Asian Development Bank, and they will see, I'll go through the scope of those projects in a moment, but the location of these, we would, to get there from Durham today, we'd have to fly probably to Hong Kong, maybe to New Zealand, then get a flight to Nuku'alofa, which is the capital of Tonga. We'd then have to spend a night in a hotel. We'd then get a ferry or a local flight up a couple of 100 miles to the Hapai group. And then we'd have to get and rent a canoe or a small speedboat to get out to these places, which are essentially small coral islands in the middle of the Pacific. They're very, very challenging locations to work, as we'll see. But we think this is, we're really excited about this. It's just been won for Infratec as a project we're going to deliver in the next 14 months. And the projects will be 100% renewable from the start. There'll be a big solar array, a big battery, and that's it. No diesel generator, no nothing. And we're really excited about that. So on each island, we're going to build a power station with a control desk and communication equipment. We're going to put a large lithium battery in that will be a Tesla. A new land-based solar PV array in a fenced-off compound. We're going to build underground or overground power networks. That's all the cables to get the power from the power station to each home. We're going to put street lights in. We're going to put metering in on every house, and plugs and lights in each building so people can actually use the energy. No diesel on there, which we'll come to in a moment. And nobody's explored biodiesel. You know, that's really, really interesting given some of the resources on these islands. And one of the islands is, as John said at the start, an active volcano called New Athol. It's the most northerly island in Tonga. It's incredibly important strategically. Owning that island means access to a huge amount of ocean resources. There's a population of 650 on that island, 1 grass runway, 1 flight every 2 weeks. It's worth noting down the name of this island and Googling some of the, or YouTubing some of the videos from it. There's a tiny wharf that was smashed, that was destroyed halfway through the tender phase of the project, and then destroyed again in 2019. by cyclones, and those are cyclones which make the island impossible to access 6 months of the year. It is an active volcano, as we understand it, but on the plus side, the lake in the John's going to come with, I'm going to say caldera, but the lake in the middle of the volcano has the best fish in Tonga, we're told. So we're prepared to take the risk for that fish. And we're going to be building a big ring of power lines around the center of the volcano and distributing electricity into all of the villages there. And we're really excited about this one. You know, let's think more fundamentally about the challenges involved with these projects. We're putting, oh good, caldera, brilliant. John said I was right. So we're talking about putting in 100% solar and battery from the start. When you actually do the economics on that energy, it's it could be up to 20 times what we pay in the UK, because we're going for 100% renewable. We're not trying to, you know, the requirement of the tender wasn't to optimize for price, and we weren't given opportunity to minimize the cost of energy for these people, which would have practically resulted in something being 95% renewable from solar and battery and 5% coming from biofuel. Billing for electricity, besides cost, presents its own challenges. So, you know, how do people get in and read the meters? Do people get in and read the meters? Is that done electronically? Do we need to back it up locally? What happens if people don't pay? What do you actually do about it on an island with 100 people? Who's going to go in and sort that one out? Is that fair to do that? We're talking about islands in the middle of, you know, that are very, very hard to access, and any delays with the community could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of delay to us. And we also need to think about how we maintain those as well. We couldn't actually visit these islands when we were bidding them, so I'd actually highlight that, funnily enough, someone was following me on my grid and dropped me an email saying, oh, I noted you're in New Zealand, can I meet up with you for a beer? And I got chatting to him. He happened to have sailed his boat from London to Tonga and was sailing past these islands, pure coincidence, and he ended up doing a load of surveys for us. And we really, really owe him, because that probably made the difference to us winning the job or not, because we understood the risks. I've only got a couple of minutes left because I want to open up for questions, but I will talk to you about Tuvalu, just because this is a pretty awesome project as well. I'll just show you these two pictures, which show you the types of islands that we might be working on as well. So Tuvalu is a tiny atoll country. It's incredibly narrow. We put solar on the building, on the image on the right, which is the fisheries building. And you'll see how close you've got the Pacific on one side, on the far side, and the lagoon on the near side. Very, very narrow. And I think you can see very quickly how that island might be very, very susceptible to sea level rise. It's also worth noting the runway on the left, and the image on the left, this a plane that's just taken off, and how constrained land is. That's used as a volleyball court when the planes aren't landing by the local children and people do their washing on that. And the land is pretty critical, but also pretty beautiful, and really looking forward to going there if I get the chance. Just to wrap up the talk, I think again, just to reinforce the interdisciplinary nature of the work we do, it presents unique financial challenges, unique technical challenges, unique social challenges, and overcoming them is absolutely core to what we do and making the project successful. And as a company moving from donor funding to projects that we own, or working with utilities much more closely, that's something we're really keen to solve, and own a lot more of the technology, own a lot more of the community engagement, which we're very, very good at, and produce really successful projects with these places. Just to finish up, I might suggest John chooses a few questions for me to answer. I'll just take a couple that jumped out before John does that. But yeah, please do connect with me on LinkedIn. I really follow LinkedIn a lot, and it's great to see what people are up to, and I find that very, very inspiring with what we're doing. I should plug my book, Decarbonising Electricity Made Simple, which is available on Amazon and wrote last year. And do follow my grid as well, which lets you, which is my sort of grid tracking program for seeing what's going on in British electricity. John, I guess you might want to sort a few questions, but just a few that have jumped out. And thank you very much for listening, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time. Lauren's asked, are any of the island grids interconnected? Meaning, I presume that means, are there any cables between some of these islands? The short answer is no. They're often very, very far apart, so that makes the cost of interconnection very expensive. We have looked at that between some of the island resorts, particularly the hotels, but I think that was more an excuse for my BD guy to go scuba diving, so he could do a survey of those. And Andy Clark asked around the use of biofuels on these islands, and I would really, really like to get involved in looking at biofuels for these islands. And my personal view is that looking at the economics, that there is a biofuel potential. We can't talk about huge volumes of biofuel, but we need something for when the solar's not running or the battery's flat. And yeah, very, very keen for that. John, did you want to pick up some of the other questions? There's quite a few in that list, some privately, some publicly. So.
Just unmuting now. Well, first of all, Andrew, I think you deserve a round of applause. Thank you very much indeed. So a quick unmute from everyone if we can, and say thank you to Andrew before we pop a couple more questions. So there we go.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, there are a couple of questions you haven't addressed, Andrew. One was very early on from George. Hi everyone, I would like to ask Andrew whether he finds electric cars have a positive effect on the decarbonisation, provided more renewable resources are used to generate the electricity.
Yeah, it's a great question, George. We don't see many electric vehicles on the islands, but in New Zealand, we've just, as in 2 o'clock this morning, we won a project actually looking at that. One of the things we're really interested in New Zealand is 2 aspects. One is charging them up with renewable energy, but also if cars are charging and we're suddenly short of generation, we're not able to provide power, or there's a line gone out, can we switch that charging off very, very quickly to keep everything else on? So keep the lights on, keep the fridges on. We don't see electric boats or ships yet, but you know, that's really is part of the journey, and I'd like to see increasing energy use on these islands through electrification of transport, particularly, and heat or cooling.
Okay, well, I dropped a question in. It struck me when I was listening to the talk, Andrew, given the island nations that you're dealing with, is there any similarity with the Caribbean? We've got John Bothwell, who's been working in Dominican Republic on the possibility of turning some of the seaweed, which has inundated the beaches there, caused by warming of the Atlantic, but could we use the seaweed to generate biofuels? The answer is a very clear yes, but of course it depends on whether or not you're getting the same kind of flux of seaweed that you have in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I'd really like to get into this. Not trying to get to the Caribbean, obviously I don't mind, but we've signed, as an organisation, we've just signed or signing a memorandum of understanding with the University in Wellington. But I'd like to internationalise that to some of this research, because you know, fundamentally the last 5% of energy is very, very hard to get. There's always, you know, a big storm or a big cyclone that means there's very, very little solar generation for a few weeks a year.
Yeah.
And having an alternative source of fuel is amazing. And actually, when we were out in Rwanda back in the DEI, you know, doing that DEI research project, we saw then the government had given out biodigesters for cow dung that they were using to make biogas for cooking. And yeah, it'd be great to explore that and see if there's a mechanism where we can can research that. Infotech would be open to that.
Okay, good. There are a couple of Andy Clark's made a couple of comments. And it's so we're leaping about, of course, with these questions. Why are Fiji and New Caledonia cheaper in terms of the electricity production?
That's a good question. Let me jump back. So Fiji and New Caledonia are cheaper for production. So I'd imagine Fiji is cheaper because it's a bit better connected logistically. It's one of the bigger islands, and I believe they've got some hydro on Fiji as well, from memory. Still pretty expensive though. This is generation cost of energy. If we were to look at the cost of generation in the UK, it would be much lower than that. Or not too, yeah, it would be lower than that. New Caledonia, I just don't know enough about it to answer that one specifically, but maybe it's subsidised.
Some work there for you, Andy. So Matthew Osborne writes, have your Infotech interventions considered bundling in microfinance institutional developments to solve some of the financial and social challenges?
Yeah, there's a very, very good scheme called it's called GGGI, the Global Green Growth Initiative, which is headed up by Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General, which is looking at exactly that, for particularly looking at the tourism and the hotel sector. It's something we're looking at, yeah, I think I think that's definitely on our radar. A lot of my work at the moment is around financing large solar arrays, and I would imagine that would quickly translate into these places. But you raise an important point, because this financing is key to this, and not just accessing that on the islands, but also developing products that are affordable and ethical for the islands as well. We don't want to lock people into a 20-year contract that's going to rip them off. None of us wants to be involved with that.
Good. One of the beauties of this online system is that we do have an answer to Andy's question.
Thanks, Brian.
Brian is right. It's French, New Caledonia, and is therefore looked after and subsidised.
I believe they just had a referendum where they didn't vote to be independent from France, which maybe the energy prices were influencing that.
Douglas, you ask your own question. I've done enough talking. You there?
Yes, I'm here.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, I typed, hang on, I'll turn on my video, start video. Yeah, I typed my question into the text box, but it strikes me that what you've got here is a closed island system where you have a very well-defined transition, which is being prepared for and planned for significantly in advance. So the basis of my question was that, my view is that 50% of the low carbon challenge is getting people on board. So I'm just wondering what evidence you have that you're able to work with people to get them to adjust their energy patterns, their behaviors, their consumptions, and also prepare them for the fact that just because the energy is cheaper, we don't necessarily want them to use more of it. So all of those things are linked together. And I mean, what sort of education program do you have to help with that?
There's a couple of good examples there. So on the Cook Islands, we worked on 4 of the outer Cook Islands, and they were built by the community. But I would argue that we do want people to consume more energy, given that they're at a very low level of usage at the moment. Mm-hmm. And January last year, we noticed in the measured data a huge jump in energy usage, and people had essentially flown back from New Zealand at Christmas with new appliances or etc. That had but they're things like washing machines, fly the washing machine back, but kettles, air conditioning, things that are much better than having 2 light bulbs and a plug socket, and so So I think there's two aspects, you know, is energy efficiency and the importance of that, but also recognizing in programs from the outset that an island baseline power might be here today because power is expensive, but we want to take it here as an outcome for the project. We want to enable economic activity. Mm-hmm. There's another example from a project. Oh, go on, John.
I'm going to cut you off, Andrew. Time's just about up.
Right.
Just very, very briefly before I formally thank Andrew, one other thing that struck me, Tuvalu has 3 letters of the alphabet consecutively, T, U, and V, which is the only other country in the world to have 3 consecutive letters of the alphabet. Right, we can close now. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Andrew. Absolutely fascinating, and given the number of questions and number of people who've been participating, I'm clearly not alone in that. So another quick round of applause, and thank you again, Andrew.